Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly bizarre historical and visual paradox. Picture a political rally. You see protesters dressed head to toe in black, faces covered by keffiyehs, waving black flags, and wearing Che Guevara t-shirts. You'd probably assume, quite reasonably, that you're looking at a radical left-wing demonstration. But what if I told you that the people in that crowd were actually far-right extreme nationalists? It sounds like a total contradiction, but it's a very real phenomenon. Today, we're exploring the strange world of autonomous nationalism and how far-right extremists ended up adopting the uniform and tactics of the far left.
Okay, let's dive right into this. To solve this modern mystery, we basically need to untangle history chronologically, moving from left to right. We'll start with this baffling paradox, trace the actual roots of left-wing autonomism, explore a concept called the social factory, look at the far-right crackdown in the 1990s, and finally see exactly how these extreme right groups stole their enemy's playbook.
Section 1. A baffling political paradox, when the extreme right looks like the extreme left.
So here's the central mystery for this explainer. Why on earth are far-right nationalists wearing Che Guevara shirts? Starting around the early 2000s, researchers and police over in Europe started noticing this really strange shift. Extreme right-wing groups were showing up to marches, but they were totally abandoning their traditional skinhead aesthetics. Instead, they were carrying black flags, which is a traditional symbol of anarchism, wearing keffiyehs, and using these graffiti-style logos that looked virtually identical to left-wing Antifa symbols.
And this brilliantly illustrates the jarring disconnect we're analyzing here. On one hand, you've got their core ideology, extreme far-right nationalism and Strasserism. But on the other hand, you have their aesthetic, black bloc demonstration tactics, Che Guevara shirts, and anti-capitalist banners. It's a complete ideological mismatch. To figure out why these copycats even exist, we actually have to travel back in time and look at the original creators of this specific aesthetic and organizational style.
Section 2. Roots of left-wing autonomism, from Detroit auto factories to the Italian hot autumn.
Let's quickly define our terms. The word autonomism comes from the Greek autonomia, which literally means the freedom to use its own laws. As a political movement, it emerged as a far-left philosophy completely committed to anti-capitalist and anti-state struggles. But crucially, and this is key, it was horizontal and anti-authoritarian. It completely repudiated those traditional, hierarchical, top-down structures that you'd typically see in communist or Leninist vanguard parties. They wanted organization to spring directly from the ground up.
So, where did this come from? Well, it has a pretty fascinating intellectual lineage. Back in the 1940s, a Trotskyist faction in the U.S. called the Johnson-Forrest Tendency started studying the spontaneous ground-up struggles of auto workers in Detroit, who were fighting against both their bosses and their union bureaucrats. Then, in the 50s, a French group called Socialismo ou Barbarie developed similar ideas. Eventually, these concepts migrated over to Italy, culminating in 1969 during what was called the Hot Autumn. This was a massive wave of unrest where 600,000 metalworkers went on strike in Turin. And that unrest birthed a potent movement in the mid-1970s known as autonomia operaia, or workers' autonomy.
Moving on to Section 3, the social factory, redefining the working class.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the theory evolved. Thinkers within the Italian movement like Mario Tronti and Toni Negri realized that the struggle had actually moved way beyond just the physical factory floor. They proposed this concept of the social factory. Essentially, they argued that society had been restructured so much that literally everything, all of society, was being put to work to reproduce capital. And because the factory was now, well, everywhere, the definition of a worker had to expand. So they coined this term, the social worker proletariat. This wasn't just men doing heavy industrial labor anymore. It included students and the youth, the unemployed, precarious service sector workers, and women engaged in unwaged domestic labor. This incredibly broad, diverse demographic formed the decentralized base of that 1970s Italian autonomia movement.
Now, because they deliberately bypassed traditional trade unions and communist parties, they had to invent their very own tactics for direct action. They used widespread absenteeism from factories to disrupt production, they organized massive rent strikes and squatted in vacant buildings, and perhaps most uniquely, they pioneered something called self-reduction. This essentially meant entire communities collectively refusing to pay the full increased prices for everyday things like public transport, electricity, and food. It was highly decentralized, heavily networked, and deeply rebellious.
All right, Section 4, the far-right crackdown, Germany in the 1990s.
To really understand how these two sides connect, we have to shift our narrative drastically from the left wing in 1970s Italy all the way to 1990s Germany. After the reunification of Germany, the government launched some pretty severe police crackdowns on the far right. In the early 90s, they banned several prominent traditional right-wing organizations. For these extreme nationalist groups, it was basically an adapt or die scenario. You see, their traditional hierarchical structures, with formal memberships and regular meetings, made them sitting ducks for law enforcement and domestic intelligence. They absolutely needed a way to survive and organize without being so easily targeted by the state.
So the crucial point here is that the specific group that adapted to this problem, who became known as the autonomous nationalists, remained incredibly small. In fact, by 2008, researchers estimated there were only about 400 autonomous nationalists actively operating in Germany.
To put that into perspective, this tactic was incredibly niche. Out of an estimated 40,000 active participants in the German far right at the time, autonomous nationalists made up roughly 1%. But here's the crazy part. Despite being a tiny fraction of the movement, their total abandonment of traditional structures in favor of this network politics allowed them to punch way, way above their weight. They caused massive ripples across the entire political landscape, and the model eventually spread from Germany to the UK, the Netherlands, Eastern Europe, and beyond.
Which brings us to Section 5, Stealing the Enemy's Playbook, Appropriating Antifa Tactics. Let's see exactly how this builds. To survive those crackdowns, these extreme right groups built a completely new strategy. They literally stole the far left's organizational model. They split into decentralized autonomous cells of just 5 to 20 members, with absolutely no formal membership roles, organizing instead via phones and the internet. Out on the streets, they started using black bloc tactics, wearing uniform black clothing and face coverings to ensure anonymity and make it nearly impossible for the police to identify them. They adopted the subcultural fashion of the left, and get this, they even shifted their public messaging to highlight anti-globalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist themes just to appeal to rebellious youth subcultures. As you can probably imagine, this caused a really fierce internal backlash within the far right itself. Traditional older members who were deeply steeped in the skinhead culture absolutely hated this new leftist image. Meanwhile, established hierarchical political parties like Germany's NPD were terrified that these violent, unpredictable, black-clad cells would completely ruin their chances of achieving any sort of mainstream political legitimacy. It was a massive culture clash within the movement. And the ideological blurring went to startling extremes. To maintain that anti-globalist and anti-imperialist posture, some autonomous nationalist groups even controversially expressed sympathy for Islamic extremist groups, framing it purely through the lens of opposing American imperialism and Zionism. Neutrally speaking, this syncretic, highly contradictory ideological shift alienated them even further from traditional nationalist groups, which just goes to show how far they were willing to twist their ideology to fit this new, rebellious, autonomous framework.
Which leaves us with a highly provocative question. If a fractured extreme right movement can successfully evade government crackdowns simply by abandoning their traditional structures, stealing their enemies' aesthetics, and adopting decentralized left-wing network politics, well, what does this actually mean for the future of political organization? When the visual language of rebellion is entirely decoupled from its original ideology, how are we supposed to understand the movements of tomorrow? It's definitely something to think about the next time you see a protest on the news. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning what you see.